Welcome back to Conversations, where I'm talking with Tal Heinrich, spokesperson for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It seems, Tal, the media is putting a lot of emphasis on the suffering of civilians in Gaza, but virtually nothing on the civilian hostages Hamas kidnapped on October 7th, some of whom happen to be American. What do we know about their condition and whereabouts?
I wouldn't say no attention is being given to the hostages, but certainly not enough, Nancy. Their plight should be at the forefront of every discussion and every broadcast about this war, really. That's the case in Israel. Unfortunately, outside Israel, it's not. There are still 133 hostages being captive in Gaza for more than 6 months now, which is really unbelievable. Parents, mothers, children, young women who we know for a fact are being sexually abused over there in Gaza, some of them being used as slaves, so to say. We know that from the accounts of hostages who returned back in November as part of this framework that we had in place that was mediated by international mediators. We are doing everything possible on our end to try to bring to their release. And we're engaged in both, there's the military avenue. We continue to exert very heavy military pressure on Hamas because that's what works against them. And at the same time, Nancy, we're working the diplomatic avenue behind the scenes to try to yield another framework of this kind. Now, when you negotiate with such a terrorist organization, and again, we didn't want to be obviously in this situation. There are no good solutions, only trade-offs, as Thomas Sowell said. You have to be very determined, but you also have to show flexibility. But I can tell you that the more flexibility Israel has shown, the more Hamas has hardened its position in the negotiations. So we hope to achieve a breakthrough. But right now, unfortunately, I have no update.
What role has the International Red Cross played in investigating this hostage situation?
Very early on, if you remember, after October 7th, one of our first demands in Israel in regards to the hostages was that the Red Cross will pay them a visit and demands to pay them a visit. We're 6 months after, and that hasn't happened. So that's a failure.
We've seen a lot of protests in support of the Palestinians. What has surprised you the most about these, which often contain overt anti-Semitic messaging?
I think maybe the scope of the protests. I want to say that I'm not surprised, though, because we've seen this hatred against Israel before. We've seen it in 2008. We've seen it in 2014 in previous rounds of conflicts. And in 2006 also, when we fought against Hezbollah in Lebanon. We see it again and again. I'm not surprised. I'm just disappointed. And it's not only anti-Israel protests, because as we're speaking right now, just over the past weekend, we saw one of these protests in the United States where you heard chants of death to America, which is really unbelievable. These are people who are calling for the destruction of America, standing on American soil, which is really unbelievable. I think that every time I'm struck by the amount of ignorance when I see like man on the street interviews in these protests, like they're being asked the very basic questions about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict sometimes, and they really know nothing about the history of the conflict. What are the real impediments to peace and how we got to where we are?
Coming up, the UN agency that perpetuated and fueled the conflict, should it even exist? We'll talk about that next. Welcome back. I'm continuing my conversation with Tal Heinrich, spokesperson for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It seems to have been forgotten by many big media outlets that members of the UN Relief Agency for the Arabs in Gaza, UNRA, were identified not just in supporting terrorists, but in actually participating in the barbaric attack of October 7th. Can you tell us specifically what some of these UN staffers did?
Some of them, Nancy, they crossed into Israel. They invaded with Hamas's army of terrorists. They went into kibbutzim, these southern communities surrounding the Gaza Strip border in Israel. Some of them abducted hostages. You had UNRWA teachers, according to accounts that we know of, who held hostages in their homes. They participated in the atrocities. And in fact, about 10% or 12% of UNRWA in Gaza is infested with Hamas. They're in bed with the terrorists, this terror organization. Not to mention that under the UNRWA headquarters, you had one of the command centers, a server farm for the terrorists, for Hamas, as if they weren't aware of that. Taking the electricity from their own facility, from their own building. And UNRWA, they cover up for Hamas's stealing of the aid that UNRWA was also supposed to distribute around Gaza. And it's been utterly failing at this mission. I can tell you that just over the past 3 days, for instance, we've had a record number over 3 days, 1,200 humanitarian aid trucks that were facilitated into Gaza, that crossed into Gaza. That is the equivalent of more than 12 stadiums of football full of humanitarian aid. Out of this number, only a very small fraction was actually distributed by this UN agency.
I understand in Israel it isn't entirely surprising to learn that UNRWA has been supporting the anti-Israeli and terrorist activities. Can you tell us more about what UNRWA has been doing over the past few years?
So UNRWA, its mere existence of this agency is unprecedented, and its sole mission is to perpetuate the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And now I'll explain. Because what UNRWA does, that's a special UN agency that is run by Palestinians for Palestinian refugees. And according to UNRWA's definition of who is a Palestinian refugee, I don't know about your family lineage, but I should be considered a refugee from Eastern Europe based on my father's side of the family, or Morocco based on my mom's side of the family. What it does, this agency, it tells Palestinians 6 generations, 5, 6 generations after the establishment of the State of Israel, that they are refugees and they deserve, special benefits, a special care as refugees, no matter where they are. Even if they are in Palestinian territory under Palestinian rule, or if they are in London, or if they live in Jordan, or in Lebanon, or elsewhere. And refugees of what? Refugees of wars that they themselves started. And until when? Until the State of Israel will cease to exist. So UNRWA, its very existence, is basically telling Palestinians that Israel has no legitimacy to exist, that it's some temporary entity. And the moment Israel will cease to exist, that's when they will stop being refugees.
For all refugees worldwide, there's a UN agency called the UN High Commission for Refugees. So why is there a separate agent specifically and more generously funded for Palestinians?
So it's a great question, again, because these two refugee agencies, so to say, under the auspices of the United Nations, they don't have the same goal. The first one that you mentioned that takes care of other refugees, every other refugee around the world who's a real refugee of a conflict, of a war, of circumstances, and the agency is dedicated to resettling them and make sure that they are able to move on with their lives no matter where they are. UNRWA's purpose is exactly the opposite. UNRWA exists to keep Palestinians as refugees. And they are the only ones in the world who are able to inherit the status of refugee.
What's your opinion on how the current U.S. administration is reacting to this conflict?
So we are grateful for the support that we've seen from the Biden administration. Very early on, President Biden stood by Israel in Israel after October 7th. He sent a strong message to Israel's adversaries across the region when he said, don't. And the Biden administration, but also, the Congress and the American people were grateful for the support that we're seeing and for the global moral leadership and moral clarity that you have been demonstrating, and also by sending us, helping us, giving us the tools to get the job done and finish this terrorist organization called Hamas, because it's not only our war. It's and we said it very early on. It's a war of the civilized world against barbarism. What happened on October 7th should never be tolerated, should never be accepted, should never happen again to any peace-loving nation. So we just happen to be on the front lines of this war right now. But all of the bad players around the world are watching. And if we don't send the right message, and if we don't keep united, it's going to be bad. And not only in our region, it's going to be bad.
Does Israel have a public relations problem with the way it engages with the outside world in describing its relationship with the Palestinians?
I get what you're saying and where you're going with this. Yes, there's the war happening on the ground, but there's also the PR war. And it's an important arena. It's part of what we do, you and I. But it's great to have support when you're fighting a war. And this is one of the most justified wars in modern history. But we're not fighting for support. We are fighting to stay alive. We're fighting because we can't let Hamas live another day and carry out another October 7th massacre.
Tal, thanks so much for talking with me today. Unfortunately, our time is up, but thanks for joining me. And for all of you at home, thanks for watching. And I hope you'll tune in again for my next conversation. So long. She's a spokesperson for Israel's Prime Minister, a journalist and a Middle East expert. My interview with Tal Heinrich starts right now. Welcome to Conversations. The Middle East remains a global hotspot. My guest today is an expert on the region. She's a veteran journalist who's currently serving as a spokesperson for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. I'm pleased to have Tal Heinrich join me. Welcome, Tal.
My pleasure to join you today, Nancy. Thank you for having me on.
Well, the war in Gaza has passed the 6-month mark. How close is Israel to crushing Hamas?
We are very close. Keep in mind, we destroyed about 19, almost 20 out of the 24 Hamas battalions. We still have 4 Hamas battalions that are operational in Rafah. That's the southern city in Gaza. We can get to it a bit later. We eliminated more than 13,000 Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists. We apprehended thousands. We injured thousands more, which means we took off the battlefield about 26,000 terrorists, but there's still a way to go. Because when we went to war in Gaza after Hamas invaded our borders with their army of jihadi, bloodthirsty terrorists on October 7th, we said that we will finish this war when Gaza will no longer pose a terror threat to Israel. And we're very, very determined to achieve this victory.
One of the hot spots in Gaza right now, as you mentioned, is a place called Rafah. Can you tell us what's going on there and why it's so strategically important?
It's important for several reasons. First, it's the southern city that borders Egypt. It shares the border with Egypt. This is where for many, many years, much of the infiltration of weapons and terror infrastructure has happened. This is one of the reasons why it's very, very strategic to us. Also, as I just said, you still have 4 Hamas operational battalions there. And if you remember, several weeks ago, the IDF, our forces, went into Rafah in a very precise and surgical operation, and we rescued two of our hostages who were being held inside the city in a very, very successful operation. So for all of these reasons, we must go and operate in a major operation in Rafah. Anyone who's saying don't go into Rafah at this point is basically telling us lose the war. You can sustain, 16 more years of Hamas rule in Gaza. That is not option. It's like telling the Allies back in World War II, you've had so many achievements, you took out so many Nazi strongholds all across Europe. Normandy was great, but don't go into Berlin. That's not an option for Israel.
Over and over, we hear calls for a ceasefire in Israel's war against Hamas. Do you think those making the calls are aware there was a ceasefire and that Hamas broke it on October 7th, just like it broke the one before that?
I think, again, it's a very good question, and some of these anti-Israel chants, which include chants for a ceasefire, and they're not only anti-Israel. I would say this, it's also anti-Palestinian. Some of these people, protesters out there, they think they might be serving the Palestinian cause, so to say, but if they're not calling on Hamas to surrender, release the hostages, then they're anti-Palestinians as well. So there will not be a ceasefire, one that leaves Hamas in power and our hostages, 133 of them, in Gaza. That is not an option. We're not giving up on our stolen people. What we said in the past, Nancy, and we still stand by it, is that we agree to facilitate humanitarian pauses in the fighting in exchange for the release of hostages.
Let's turn our attention to the way the media has been covering the conflict. When Israeli officials make a statement, it seems like the media often reframes it with words like unverified or alleged. But when statements come from the Palestinian side, it's almost always regarded as fact. Like, for example, the death statistics given to us by Hamas Health Ministry. What do you want us to know about the way media outlets are covering this?
First, thank you for pointing this out. It's very important because we always say that any kind of reporting, any numbers, any claims coming out of Gaza are controlled by Hamas. Sometimes these media outlets, they talk about what's going on in one of the hospitals, let's say, and I can tell you that in every hospital that IDF forces went into, we found ammunition and terrorists. We've had, battles, fighting taking place. So all of these places are being used as shields for their terror machine because they think that, hiding inside a hospital will give them some kind of immunity. And sometimes it is so ridiculous because you see media outlets talking to alleged doctors, so to say, without understanding that these doctors are ones that were appointed by Hamas. And in some cases, they are Hamas themselves. We arrested one of the doctors at El Nassar Hospital a couple of weeks ago, and in his interrogation, he said that in 2010, he was already recruited by Hamas and 16 of his staff, and that's just one example, 16 members of the staff in the hospital, if it's nurses and other doctors, sanitarians, they were also Hamas operatives, which I don't know how it works. Like during the day, you operate, you work to save lives, and then you get the call, you take arms, you take lives. I don't know how it works, but again, it's and again, there was also if you remember in the beginning of the war, the so-called strike on Al Ahli Hospital. That hospital that was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad missile that fell short in the parking lot of the hospital, and they turned it around. They said, well, it was an Israeli missile without any fact checking, without any proof. Media outlets out there went and quoted Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Yesterday, we just put out a video of a Palestinian Islamic Jihad member during his interrogation in Israel admitting how they turned the story around and how their chain of command worked exactly on that day to inform the organizations and then so the media outlets to blame Israel for their own misfired missile that hurt their own people.
Can we discuss some of the myths that are used when describing Israel? For example, we hear that Israel practices apartheid, or that Israel is a colonial or occupying power. Can you set the record straight?
Israel is not an apartheid state, okay? I can sit here and talk to you, but why not? But I think if you ask Israeli Arabs, Israeli Arabs who live in our country, they have full citizenship, just like myself. We have Arab Supreme Court justices. We have Arab doctors serving in, Arabs serving in any kind of position in Israel. Arabs serving in the military, as some of them. So people don't really have a real view of what's happening in Israel, and they judge our country based on their, sometimes again, it's really anti-Semitic views, based on what Israel haters out there say Israel actually is. And that's really, it's simply not true. We are, and going back to your question, we are the Jews, the indigenous people to the land of Israel. And you know what? Maybe it sounds funny. I don't have to like milk in my coffee, but I still acknowledge that milk comes from a cow. And I'm saying this, you don't have to love Jews, but for the love of God, know where we came from. Jews came from Judea. That is unbelievable when some people deny the historical, the biblical connection between the Jewish people and the biblical heartland. We've been there for, more than 3,000 years. We worship the same God. We speak the same language.
There are still dozens and dozens of hostages still being held by Hamas, some of whom are Americans. We'll talk about that next.